Welcome to the Revelation Companion Podcast. Listen in as we dive deeper into the book of Revelation through special episodes and sermon recaps. Let's join the conversation now. Hey, welcome back to the Revelation Companion Podcast, episode 11, coming at you. We have a rainy summer day in Spokane.
Yeah.
Ryan, you know what I learned since the last time we recorded?
What?
We have a lot of South Dakota fans here at True Hope.
South Dakota?
Yeah.
Why?
Remember, I was wearing my South Dakota hat, aka the San Diego Padres. I've had so many comments on that.
You know it's San Diego, right?
I do know it's San Diego, but people came up to me and they're like, "I'm also a South Dakota fan." I was like, "This is terrific." So, anyways, we've always said maybe this prophetic, like True Hope will find another plant down in San Diego, and so maybe that was it. Maybe that was the cue that,
or maybe South Dakota,
or South Dakota. So, less than a few folks. So, anyways, we're happy to be here.
Yep.
We have a fun one today. Babylon in America. This is a hybrid episode, special episode, kind of a unique topic, something you've had on your heart since the very beginning of our series, paired with a few sermons that you recently taught that talk a lot about Babylon.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to kind of accomplish a couple things. Firstly, I want to kind of go over chapters 15 and 16, Bowls of Wrath. And not too much, but just make sure we're, following, tracking with that. And then, that's chapter 15 and 16 of Revelation. And then chapter 17 and 18 is about the mystery Babylon and its destruction and its fall. And then, of course, chapter 19, which was the subject of this last weekend, is on the return of Christ, which the first few verses of chapter 19 deal with the fall of Babylon. But then mostly it has to do with the coming of Christ on the white horse and the combination of two suppers, the supper of the Lamb and the supper of the birds eating the flesh of the kings of the earth. I kind of want to do a little bit of a companion just overview, but I do want to address the particular question that I think I've been asked before, that I've wrestled with, that I've actually asked my dad when I was younger. Like, is America Babylon the Great? Like, is America the Great Babylon, referred to in chapters 17 and 18? And so I suppose I'll just start there to not force people to just be frustrated and have to wait until I get through other things to answer that question. Here's my answer to that question. Is America Babylon? Don't know and yes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think the answer as no is most easily refuted. Okay, here's what I mean. I think every nation has the potential to become the personification of what Babylon is as a spirit. Because I think I would be in the camp of reading and studying Revelation that says Babylon is a nation or a world system or a governance structure where humanity is organized in community but intentionally godless. So I think you could argue that that's not America, right? You could look at our founding, you could look at some of our history, and you could say, no way, America was not Babylon. Look at our founding. But I'd say every nation can become Babylon. And then the question would be, has America become more Babylon or less Babylon since her founding? And I think what I would say there is she's become more Babylon, not less, as she's grown and as the centuries have peeled by. So is it possible then that America could be the great eschatological Babylon, mysterious Babylon, the mystery world power at the end of the age? Sure. But is it also totally possible that America either fades or, God forbid, ceases to be, and the fulfillment of Revelation 17 and 18 in an actual future historical sense is not America? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I know this is mysterious, but after all, this is called a mystery. So there's basically three options when we're looking at Revelation 17 and 18 on the question of who is Babylon. The first option is Babylon is the historical geographical site in Iraq, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I don't know if you know this or not, but Saddam Hussein actually was trying to build like his house and like a palace on the ancient ruins of actual Babylon.
Wow.
Yeah, fact. There's actually some interesting things you can look up about that. So actually trying to kind of like recreate the great city of Babylon in an interestingly odd way. And you can actually, if you go there, you can actually still see some of the walls. There's been some surveying that's been done. And in fact, there's even some fulfillment of prophecy that people interestingly think about, that Babylon will be made into a den of jackals and like wolves and hyenas and stuff. And if you actually go there, like that's true. Like that area of ancient Babylon is like totally abandoned, and there's like animals that roam free, and it like kind of is the fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy, oddly enough.
Like literal animals,
Yeah.
jackals.
Yes, actual fact. Wow. If anybody wants to nerd out about that, there is a documentary. I don't know if it's on YouTube or if it's on Netflix. I can't remember, but I watched it because I'm a nerd like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is interesting. So here's what I would say. The first option with Babylon, from a what is Babylon, or better stated, who is Babylon? It is actually a city and a place in Iraq that had a historic empire that has actual historical interaction with Israel as a people, and that somehow will be resurrected. Now, if that's true, that certainly feels like that's not new. We're not living in the very end of end times then, because there's quite a bit of work that has to be done for that to occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's one option that you would have in interpreting this. Like, what is Babylon? I don't favor that option. Here's why. Why does John call it the mystery? Why doesn't he just say Babylon instead of the mystery of Babylon? So I would take that that's symbolic, and it means something other than the literal historical city geographically of Babylon. The other option you could take, second interpretive option, is Rome. Because I think there's good argument that most people think when Babylon's being referred to here in Revelation 17 and 18 to the original readers, the original audience who received this book in AD 95, who would they have thought? Rome. So now we are here 2,000 years later, almost. Is it still mean Rome? Rome still is around. Is it a reprised Rome? Is it the spirit of Rome? Is it some sort of Western European alliance? Is the reference to 10 kings that are going to receive future power, and then 7 kings that were a part of the original timestamp when this book was written, that we should be giving us the clues that this is Rome? Like, is it that? So I think your first option is literal, historical, physical Babylon in Iraq. I think your second option is Rome, literally like a reprised Rome, because that's the geography and superpower empire it was pointing to then. So that has to be the same superpower that resumes in the end. Or a third option, and I would favor this option, is it's whatever world superpower is the bee's knees at the end of the age when Christ returns, that becomes the fulfillment of Babylon the great whore that aligns herself to the beast, the Antichrist in his system, but ends up being oddly devoured by that system, being cast aside, because that's what the prophecy reveals. And that is upon which the nation and superpower upon which Christ returns and brings final judgment. So in that sense, okay, so those are your options. Literal, historical, ancient Babylon in Iraq, Rome. Some people even go Roman Catholic Church because of that. So they go, it's not Rome, it's the church in Rome. Some think that. I favor the third option, which is it's so right now. Let me ask you this: what is most closely fulfilling Babylon in our day and our time?
It'd be the United States.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I hate saying that. I hold out hope for my country. I'd like to see great revival. But when you live in a country, and we don't live in a country that's doing everything Romans 17, 18 Babylon is doing, but the closest thing to it. I mean, debauchery, redefinitions of morality, extreme excess in wealth, the merchants, the ship traders, the kings of the earth, all lamenting because of her powers and her potential fall. I mean, America seems close. There'd be a handful of other nations. I don't think it's fair just to say America, but
now there are other countries, big countries that have tremendous influence in our world.
Yep.
But I think the key thing with the United States is the United States sets the tone for so much.
Yep.
And so that is really the superpower.
Seated upon many waters. The waters are defined and interpreted by the angel as many peoples, many languages, many nations. America's the most melting pot, most immigration centric, diverse country. Even our governance structure is states versus federalism. There's a lot of things about it that a lot of people, and I want to say this, I want to be really careful right now. I am not overtly saying America is Babylon, but that's why I said maybe, could be, yes, but definitely not no, unless we had some great revival. Things are trending more Babylonistic. If that's not a word, but it was fun to say. Babylonian. Things are tending more Babylonian than not for America in the current moment, wouldn't you say? I would say so.
No, there's kind of a thing behind the scenes where it's everyone's like, let's get America back on track, or let's get America back to what it was. But like, in some ways, America becoming more Babylon, I mean, that's kind of what Revelation is depicting, is that the world will become more.
Yeah, I mean, that depends on your view. There are people, there's that would be the premillennial view, which we'll talk about in our next podcast.
Right.
And I'll preach about this next Sunday. But the view that the world is getting worse until Christ returns, that's more of a premillennial position. If you're a postmillennial, you actually think, no, we should fight for America to be as Christian as possible so that we can be the leading force at bringing Christendom to bear on the world, because we're going to bring into being 1,000-year reign of glory and peace and hand it over to Jesus when he returns.
Right.
So when America was founded, most of the eschatological views were postmillennial. We were the great city on a hill, the great light. And on one hand, America did fulfill some of those things. The great missionary sending nation. See how convoluted it can get?
Yeah, it's really tough.
So on one hand, it's like, I don't know. The story's not written. The book is not closed. The answer is not revealed. So is America Babylon? Can't say. Does America feel a lot like Babylon? Yeah. Is she finally the eschatological Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18? Can't say. Could she turn course and experience great revival and not fulfill that role? She could.
Right.
Could she continue to degrade in her decadence to be the exact fulfillment of Revelation 17 and 18? Yeah. Could the return of Christ be a lot further out than any of us think? And the truth is, America as an empire will recede, and there'll be another great superpower that actually becomes the fulfillment, or another one after that. It could be.
Right.
How am I to know?
Yeah. I think you've said that to me before. Like, you have a good friend who's a Bible historian and just a history buff. And what is it that many nations rise and fall? There's a set amount of time every 200 years or 250 years.
Oh, I don't know the
and
exact,
America is past that.
Yeah, we're 260 years into 250 years in.
So, I mean, many empires haven't lasted this long.
Yeah. I mean, that's just kind of the way of history. Empires rise, empires fall. It is what happens. So anyway, I don't think this is a dodge, and I hope no one listening to this feels like I'm totally let down right now. Like he wouldn't answer the question. No, I am answering the question. Is America Babylon? Yes. No. Maybe. How? Yes. Well, she's exhibiting characteristics that feel like world superpower, increasingly not wanting anything to do with God. That's the yes. No, we are not fully demonstrating the fulfillment of Revelation 17, 18 in current America. Does that make sense? Maybe. The book's not closed yet. There's still time for her to either repent and write a different story, or continue to fall into decadence and rebellion and maybe potentially play that role. But even if we do fall into decline and decadence and rebellion, doesn't mean we'll play that role. There could be another nation that plays that role, another world superpower. So I think the better question, this is a lot like the last podcast that we did. The question is not, is America Babylon? The question is, what parts of my life and my world are in bed with Babylon? Babylon, what is Babylon is a better question than who is Babylon. Just like what is the Antichrist is a better question than who is the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Babylon is the world system that increasingly says we don't need or want God.
Yeah.
That is how Babel started in the plains of Shinar in Genesis chapter 11, where essentially a group of people who were rebuilding civilization after the flood decided they could do life and civilization and existence depending on themselves and each other without need of God. And they thought they could become some version of God by building a tower as high into the heavens. And God responded to that rebellion with scattering their languages and spreading them apart. And so That was the ancient Babylon. And then, of course, Babylon materialized into a world superpower. For, by the way, an epic of close to 1,000 years in many different variations. But its intensity was much shorter than that, right? It's similar to like Rome. Rome was an empire that many will say, some could say lasted for 1,000 years, but it didn't quite. I mean, it was shorter than that and had a short season of peak. And so even with America, 250 years in, we might be at the beginning of decline. There are some sociologists and historians who think that, like, we're starting to see some fragmentation. And so just kind of like a curve, right? Like everything's going up and then it's kind of plateaus. It's like, are we going to dip and then reinvent, or are we going to dip and dive? It's basically that question. And so, I feel like the story's to be written, but what is Babylon is a better question. What is Babylon is it's a spirit. It's an anti-Christ, anti-God, self-reliant, decadent, adulterous, immoral, haughty, proud, excessive, affluent, wealthy, influential, culture-shaping type empire. That the world gets drunk on her immoralities. Here's a story. In 2001, I visited Romania with other students at that time. I was a young adult, so college-age students. And we visited Romania. Romania at that point was only a decade or so, maybe a decade and a half, into a Western capitalistic reimagining, because Ceausescu was a dictator there. I want to say, I'm trying to pull from memory here, unprepared, but I want to say in the 80s, Ceausescu was put on trial by his own people for his crimes against his own nation, exploiting them, building a huge palace. It's like the second largest. I toured the palace. It's the second largest building in the world. Built it on the backs of his own people. Communism. Wow. There was obviously bread lines, food lines, just great poverty and violence, and the just, quite frankly, the lack of success of a socialistic communistic regime, and how it just sounds really good in theory, but it doesn't work out in actual lived experience. So he got wind that there was a coup. People were coming for him. Bottom line is, between his security or whoever, and they told us all the stories. It was fascinating. The people arrested their own president, their own dictator, held a trial for him in the middle of the night, shot him and his wife, put them to death, and tried to rebuild their country on a democratic republic platform. And our goal in being there was like 10 or 15 years after the fall of communism in Romania and it being rebuilt. And we were there visiting churches as they're doing ministry, kingdom ministry, gospel ministry in that context. And I'll never forget just how different that country looked. Like everything was drab and like gray and like cookie cutter. The effects of communism on like art and architecture and culture are like unmistakable. In fact, another little fun fact, I've been to Budapest, Hungary, and they call it like the gateway to the East as far as from Europe. And you can really see Western architecture and influence on one part of Buda and Pest are two different cities in one city with a river. I think it's the Danube River in the middle of them. And you can almost see like, it's like this looks Eastern and this looks Western. Wow. You can really see that in the architecture. It's fascinating. Cool place to visit, by the way. So all that to say, in Romania, it's just drab. We're visiting churches, doing gospel ministry. And I met this Romanian Christian woman who said this to me. I'll never forget this. She said, because I kind of asked her, like, what do you think about like the world and like America? She's like, I love your people, but I hate your country. It's a Christian woman in Romania. I said, whoa. I mean, tell me more about that. She's like, Americans are great, but the filth of like your pornography and your capitalistic excess and your values, so on one end, when we were under communism, we begged for bread, but now we have prostitutes on street corners. And she's just like, it was just that I was young. That really impacted me. I'm like, how could this Christian woman, a part of the kingdom of God, have such a negative view of my country when I kind of had a view of my country that was just like, we're like the best thing since sliced bread. Like we're like bringing the kingdom of God to the nations. Like we're the missionary outpost of the world, sending missionaries all over the place to evangelize with the gospel. And here's what I'd say. Like a lot of things that are true, you have to hold both tensions at the same time. It is true America has done a ton of good. It is true that America is a great nation. It is true that America has been founded on principles that have significantly godly influence. It is true that America is not eschatological Babylon right now. But it is also true that America is wavering. And it is also true that America struggles with significant idolatry and significant immorality. And that at this point in history, in 2024, America is actually a mission field. There are churches and Christians in other parts of the world sending missionaries to America because we have lost our light and we are not en masse following the way of Jesus like we have. It's not to say America is our hope. It's not. It's the country we live in. We're citizens of the kingdom before we're the citizens of America. But it's just to recognize, like, it's both and. There's some good and some bad.
Yeah.
And when you hear another Christian just say, yeah, there's some things we're grateful for because we're no longer under communism, but there's some things we're also struggling with because America's filth is belching up on the shores of our minds and our streets. And I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yeah. Yeah.
That'll wake you up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to me, what I would say to Christians listening to this podcast that are mad at me right now, and they think I'm somehow like anti-America, you should get out more. Like travel, like if you can, or read more broadly and understand that there's a fine line between abandonment of your nation, which I'm not advocating. Like I want revival and I do have hope, believe it or not, that like if the church will return to her prophetic station, hold the line on truth and embody grace to our neighbors, we can turn a nation around if we can turn our neighbors around.
Ooh, that's a good one.
But if you can't turn your neighbors around and you will not live as the light, right?
Yeah.
Hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. If we won't do that, I think that America will go the way of every superpower where Christians don't act like salt, leaven, and light.
Yeah.
It'll go by the way of Babylon. And it will be to be determined if we are the fulfillment of Revelation 17:18.
Yeah.
Now, one other idea on this. If you're a preterist, you don't really care what I'm talking about. When you do, but you're like, whatever. All these questions are answered in the first century. Right? You're just like, this already happened. There is no future Babylon.
Because Rome was Babylon and it was fulfilled.
Yep. That's that particular view. I don't hold that view. And I can tell you a little bit why. If we just start to kind of dive into, let me actually pull up the chapter. We start to dive into why this is. Like to me, if we look at Revelation 17, which is the introduction of the great prostitute, one of the angels who had the 7 bowls says to John, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. So this is clearly Babylon. She rides on the scarlet beast with blasphemous names, with 7 heads and 10 horns. That's a reference to chapter 13, which is the Antichrist, right? She's adorned in wealth, so she looks the part of an affluent civilization, but she's very impure, and her name is a mystery. This is, to me, one of the largest giveaways for why I think the preterist position begs. Why a mystery? Well, you could say because it's Babylon, but it's referring to first century Rome. Okay, fine. Let's move down a little bit further when the angel gives the explanation. So when John replies in verse 6, I marvel, the angel says, why are you marveling? I'll explain this to you. Basically, the angel starts to explain it in verse 9. You see verse 9 of chapter 17? Here's what the angel says. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads of the beast here are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. So we are told that the 7 heads are 7 mountains. Now, I mentioned this in my sermon a few weeks ago. The Septimonium was an actual cultural feast in Rome in the first century that celebrated the fact that Rome was a city on 7 hills. Now, notice the next thing that's pointed out. They are also 7 kings. So the 7 heads and 10 horns are 7 mountains, but also seven kings. It's both and. So people who like to say this isn't Rome, they say it can't be the Rome because it's seven kings. I'm like, well, no, it says they are also. So it's seven hills and it's seven kings. So if it's going to be Rome, then we need both the descriptor of seven mountains and the descriptor of seven kings to both fit Rome. Right?
Right.
So we know the seven mountains fit Rome. That's very clear. Here's the question we got to ask. Do the seven kings fit first century Rome? Keep reading what happens here in verse 10. There are also seven kings, 5 of whom have fallen. What do you think that means? Died, passed away, used to be. All those are questions we'd hold in our minds. One of the kings is, what do you think that means?
Currently.
Yep. And another is yet to come.
Future.
Yep. And when he does come, he'll remain only a little while. So it feels like what's being said here is the seven mountains seems to fit Rome, but it also refers to seven kings. If those seven kings are Rome, then it would seem like the time in which this message is being received, or something about its significance, is after 5 of them have been, and one of them is, and one is still yet to come. And if you keep reading, it gets a little bit interesting here, where he says, as for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th. So the beast is actually after the 7th king, but it belongs to the 7. So it's almost like separate from, but still enfolded within the 7. So the beast then becomes, in light of Revelation 13, this Antichrist world system. The harlot, the prostitute, Babylon, becomes the particular national expression upon which rides that spiritual entity of the beast through political power.
Yeah.
The second beast of Revelation 13, or the false prophet, as he is described in Revelation 16, is more of the spiritual religious component of that world superpower, that Antichrist superpower. So I think that's how I would interpret the 8th, but that's very confusing. So let's ask the question, though, before we wrestle with the 8th being the beast, but he belongs to the 7 prior. Well, hold that thought. Keep reading verse 12. These are, by the way, verses 9 through 12 are some of the hardest verses in all of Revelation, outside of probably Revelation 20, which I preach on this Sunday, to wrestle with. And the 10 horns, so we had seven heads, but we also had 10 horns in description of this Babylon thing. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power. So there's 10 more kings still to come. They are to receive authority as kings for a short time, 1 hour with the beast. There's that 8th thing. But they belong to the 7th. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Okay, now let's pause. So if the 7 heads, which are the 7 mountains of Rome, seems like the most evidence-based conclusion of a first century reading, even if you're a preterist, and I actually am not a preterist, but I would agree with that. But if the 7 kings, which are also indicative of the 7 heads, need to have that same connection to Rome, let's see if first century Rome maps onto the 7 kings. Because it does map onto the 7 mountains.
Okay.
Are you following me?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying.
So to really wrestle with this, with the description that 5 have fallen, one of them is, and one is still to come, let's try to map that onto Roman history of its kings. This becomes a question of when you start the Roman Empire. Do you start it when Rome was a republic? Do you start it when Rome became an empire? Who was the first emperor of Rome?
That trivia question, I do not know.
Okay, there's a couple of answers. Some say Julius Caesar in 44 BC. The founding of Rome as the empire becomes different than when Rome was a republic ruled by the Senate. Okay?
Okay.
So this is Roman history stuff. But essentially, Julius Caesar, some people say, is the first Roman emperor. He gets killed, by the way, at the E2 Brutus famous comment when his conspirators come against him and stab him and they don't want him to be the emperor. Yeah, fascinating stuff. Some say that Julius Caesar was not the first Roman emperor, but that rather Octavian, or as we would know him as Augustus, was the first Roman emperor. Interestingly, the reign of Augustus goes from 31 BC to AD 14. We have the reign of Augustus occurring when Jesus Christ was born,
Right.
because there was a census in the land, and the Gospels talk about this. After him was Tiberius from 14 AD to 37 AD. Then we had Gaius or Caligula, then Claudius, then Nero. Nero, if you start with Julius Caesar, was the sixth emperor. So Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, Nero. So if you start there, this feels pretty good if you're a preterist, because you're like, well, if we start with Caesar, or Julius Caesar, that's where we get the idea of Caesar being the placeholder name going forward. Then what you have is 5 that have fallen: Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius. The one that is, which is who? Nero in 54-68. He ruled from AD 54 to AD 68. Which is interesting because then he also makes sense, because you're like in Romans or Revelation 13, this requires mystery. 666 is the number of his name, and that's well translated in Hebrew gematria to Nero.
Okay.
Feel me?
Yeah, yeah.
So then he is the one, and then the one that will be is the 7th. But here's where it breaks down. After that is Galba, who only ruled from 68 to 69, then Otho in 69, then Vitellius in 69, then Vespasian in 69 and 70, before Titus shows up.
Wait, there were 3 different people in 1 year?
Yes.
Wow.
Massive turbulence in the Roman Empire post Nero. But here's where it doesn't line up. It doesn't line up because AD 70, which is the fall of Jerusalem, the great destruction, if all this is supposed to be fulfilled before AD 70, we end up actually having a bunch more than the one that is, which is supposed to have all these things happen if you have a preterist view.
Oh,
does that make sense?
Yeah, we're over
There's
the
too
count.
many. We're over the count.
Okay.
So we're over the count. So it works really nicely up to Nero, but we're over the count. So then people go, well, what if we don't start with Julius Caesar because he was like the first emperor? What if we start with Augustus because Caesar was like murdered? So we start with Augustus. Well, then he's the first. Tiberius is the second. Gaius is the third. Claudius is the fourth. Nero is the fifth. And then what if we sandwich Galba, Otho, and Vitellius into one because they're so short, or we omit them? Then we get Vespasian in the last piece, and then we get Titus. Well, then the problem with that is the dating of the book becomes confusing, because if you have that view and you don't think, you're not a preterist, you tend to think this book fits the dating of Domitian, which he's actually the emperor after Titus. So that doesn't work. So then you go, well, shoot, where do we start to where we get the current reigning emperor is Domitian? Because I think this book was written in AD 95. And let me just shorthand this for everybody. There's books written on this. None of the math works. So none of the successive kings of Rome, according to our history and understanding of the Roman Empire, map very nicely onto 5 have fallen, 1 is, 1 will be.
Wow.
What do you do with that?
I don't know. What do you do with that?
Yeah. Welcome to a lot of humility in biblical interpretation of apocalyptic literature. You can say, what do you do? Here's what I do. I go, this is where this symbolism is really important. The 7 mountains being the 7 heads, that being close association to Rome makes a lot of sense. Knowing exactly what John is thinking as it pertains to the 5, or the angel, I should say, not John, the angel who tells him the 5 that were, the 1 that is, the 1 that will be, but then the 8 that will be, but that will belong to the 7. Maybe that introduction of the 8th beast is just trying to say 7 is a completion number, and this is a fullness of kings, and you find yourself in the part of the story where 5 have gone, but the one that is the 6th one.
Yeah.
And the number 6 is symbolic because the number 6 is the number of man, or the number of, in fact, 666 is really bad man. And you're living under that reign, and the world will experience the dominating power of that animation until there becomes an eighth one outside of that's of the same historical precedent, but is to be in the future.
Yeah.
So I would, and I don't think this is an easy resolution for me. I would look at this and go, yeah, I just don't know. If it is literal, we're not seeing, meaning if it's referring to actual kings then and not symbolic at all, it's an ordering of these emperors that is kind of mystifying to us. You can make it work. You just have to say the angel is not including Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian.
Yeah, I can.
They're just omitted because they were so short. But when you have Caesar, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and then Nero, there you go. But even if we go with that view, I don't become a full preterist, or excuse me, a partial preterist. Full preterist is a heretical view. Full preterism, it's the podcast, so I need to explain this stuff. Full preterism is the theological idea that Christ has already returned. That is theological error. That dare I say, heresy. That is an error. But our brothers and sisters in Christ who are preteristic, the accurate term is they're partial preteristic. Because what they're meaning is this stuff's been fulfilled, but there's one thing that hasn't.
Right.
Christ has not come. Okay? So what we just read in chapter 19, that's still coming. But everything before that, it's already been fulfilled. It was for the first century, not for us. I mean, it's for us in the sense that it informs us and teaches us. But it's not for us in the sense that we're looking for these prophecies to be fulfilled.
Yeah. Now, there's a word that you've used, something eschatology, that is similar to the term partial preterist. What's the difference?
No, it's not similar. It's different. It's called inaugurated eschatology.
That's what I'm thinking of.
And my view, again, of inaugurated eschatology would come to bear on this. It's something that has happened and yet will happen in its fullest fulfillment still to come. So in other words, has there been a city on seven hills, Rome, that was a world superpower that was so big, so dominant, it filled the world with all of its luxuries, immoralities, and filth? Yes. Yeah. Will there be one at the end in the same spirit of Rome, but not necessarily the same geography of Rome? Yes. Inaugurated eschatology. Have there been kings that have come and gone, and there's kings that are currently leading, but there's a king that will come that is an eighth type of king, but he belongs to the line of kings over superpowers? Yes, that's the Antichrist. That's an inaugurated eschatological approach.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, good question. Here's the bottom line. None of the countings of the seven kings connected to the seven heads, which is the seven mountains and the seven kings, map perfectly onto the way history has actually gone. So the question becomes, do you treat it as a symbolic picture, a number of completeness of Roman history, of world history, of Babylon's history? We just don't know.
So what do you do with verse 12? What do you do with the extra 10 kings?
Got it.
What's this 1 hour?
If you take a symbolic approach, what you're looking at here is there's seven kings that have been, and they symbolize the way the world systems will go until their eighth king, which is that future Antichrist, right? Which is of the order. So in other words, he won't just be a spirit. He'll actually embody a kingly kingdom. Make sense?
Yep.
The future 10 kings are a new and future association of 10 powerful leaders who will join that eighth king, the beast, in that future Babylon that will actually fulfill them Babylon partnering with these 10 kings and the beast, the Antichrist, and then them actually eventually turning on Babylon because God put in their hearts to do so as Babylon is finally destroyed at the end of the age.
Wait, so the 10 join the 8 and they form like a world super alliance?
Yes.
And then at some point the 10 turn on the 8?
They turn on Babylon the harlot.
Oh, got it.
The symbolism of that national, multi-people language on the waters, drunk with immorality, drunk with excess. So that cultural spirit that is excessive, taunting, against God, apart from God, that begins to grab hold of a nation when a singular leader who is the Antichrist figure through world power joins power with 10 other kings. there's your picture of the final eschatological showdown of the mystery of Babylon and the beast upon which she rides. Until the beast on which she rides turns on her and kills her, which is what this chapter says.
Wow.
Now, what does that mean? Kills her. Well, fuels and exacerbates her addictive interest in self-autonomy and anti-God life until it actually destroys her. The beast, the Antichrist, and his false prophet and a confederation of 10 kings, whatever that means, they're pouring gasoline on the anti-God Babylon spirit. What might that do to people caught up in that spirit who have the mark on them of Babylon, mark of the beast on them? I think there's a spiritual principle there. It's like an addict. Eventually, what started as a hit that made you feel like you were awesome and everything was great turned on you and consumed you until it eventually erased you. Right? So then the question becomes, those 10 kings, are those literal? A lot of people think they are. Are they symbolic? That's a good question. The number 10 is also a lot like the number 7.
Right.
It's a number of fullness. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's been used in association with 144,000. The numbers 7, 10, and 12 are interesting numbers to deal with because they often carry symbolic association. So we're always stuck trying to figure out, what does that mean? Bottom line is that the 10 though, the 10 kings which are to come, they are not meant, they are clearly identified by the angel as not first century powers. So you want to know how the partial preterist interprets that?
Yeah.
They think this is the Nero redivivus myth, that because all of this is connected to the 6th emperor, which is Nero, and there would be one that would follow Nero, that would be the fulfillment of all these things that would happen, that essentially Nero would come back because it was rumored that he had died, but he really didn't die. This is called the Nero redivivus myth, and that he would bring with him 10 kings from Parthian kings east of Rome, and that they would come ride with him and eventually take Rome back over, which if you look at that post Nero, it's why you have so much tumult in Rome. You have Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. In the stretch of a year and a half, there's 4 emperors. A time of great unsteadiness.
Where does that idea come from? What you just
The Nero redivivus myth.
Yeah. Like that's not in the Bible.
No, it's what people think, and what other historians tell us was a little bit of a folklore thing that was stirring around the Roman Empire during the time in which the Great Fire in Rome happened. And I think it was in 65. And then where Nero dies in 68, there was a rumor going around that he wasn't dead, that he had escaped and he was going to come back. So people wonder, is John and the words the angel's giving him, is it a reference to that? So that when the first century, if this book was written in AD 65 through 68, that's why there's all that discussion. So the people living in Smyrna or Thyatira or Ephesus, they're like, oh man, yeah, that's Nero. Nero's going to come back. It's also why the language of one of the heads had died with a mortal wound but was going to come back to life. Some also, that's more evidence for the idea of the Nero redivivus myth. I'm not persuaded by it. I just think it's interesting. I don't stress out about this. Like, if you can't tell, like, my level of confidence on what the like lock nailed interpretation of this part of the text is like pretty low. But that doesn't intimidate me, because what I need to know is, am I in bed with Babylon? What I need to know is Jesus hasn't returned yet. What I need to know is not everything was fulfilled in AD 70. Even if you're a partial preterist, even if I was to join your team and say, yeah, a lot was, there's still a lot that hasn't. Rome did ransack Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed in AD 70. That did happen. But what you would assume would happen with it, which is the return of Christ, didn't happen.
Right.
So there's still some stuff to come. So parts of this book then make me go, well, are these things speaking to that? Well, it's a good question. Maybe they are, or maybe they're not. But when we get into the detail of the text, what we know for sure, because we want to do right by the Bible, we don't want to be just like fast and loose. The angel tells us the 7 heads are the 7 mountains of some great city. That is either past Rome or, I don't know, I guess the future Babylon is going to need to be a city on 7 hills. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But it's not just 7 mountains. It also has to include the history of 7 kings, 5 that fell, 1 that was, and 1 that was still to come. And then it has to include the idea that there is an 8th, and that would be the beast, of which we've read about in Revelation 13. But there'll be a future time where that beast gets power from 10 new kings. Mm-hmm. Is that Nero Redivivus myth of the AD 68s through 70? Maybe. I don't think so. Is it still to come? I think so. What does it symbolize, or what is it pointing to? Does it actually have to be Rome or the Roman Catholic Church or something? Like, because if the 7 mountains are Rome, then it has to be Rome. So then we know the Antichrist is going to rise in Rome. It has to be Rome. Mm-hmm. And somehow we got to watch out for 10 leaders in the European Union that are associated with Rome. If Rome gets folded into the EU, mm-hmm. which it is, then is that what it is? Is the Antichrist come from the European Union, and maybe they get in league with Rome somehow? And this is where everyone starts speculating. And what I just want to say is, I'm not here to be your killjoy and say you can't speculate, but I am going to be your responsible reader. And I'm going to say none of these things map on these clearly. They don't. You need to slow your roll in imagining you've got this part of the book licked. Because what does it mean too that Babylon will fall in 1 hour? It's said over and over again. What does it mean too that these kings will join the beast for 1 hour? As everyone knows, as I've interpreted this book myself, I think we're dealing far more with symbols than statistics.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a hot flash of great power concentrated around a spiritual force and entity called the beast, who will also mesmerize and bring into its allegiance a great world power that is affluent and immoral and excessive. And this will be like a wicked concoction of nation, world power, religious cult, and just anti-God spirit. And this will take hold of a nation and many nations. And their rule and reign will be hot and intense, but short. Yeah, that's how I would kind of go. That's the best I can do with this.
Yeah.
Is America that? Not right now, but could she become that? I guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I do think so. Can any nation become the spirit of Babylon? Yes. Will one nations in conglomerate fulfill the actual eschatological Babylon of this time, which will be the entity in league with the beast and the nations that Christ comes to with the words of his mouth, judge and rule at his second coming? Yes. Yes. And so we got to also understand that Revelation 17 and 18 needs to be read connected to Revelation 19. Okay? And so this is important because the first part of chapter 19, chapter 18 is all about the kings, the merchants, the sailors, the angels, kind of like this long chapter waxing eloquent about the destruction of Babylon. And what we have in chapter 19 is the multitude crying out in heaven about what? The judgment of the great prostitute. They're rejoicing because Babylon fell. Its smoke rises up forever and ever. The 24 elders, which we were introduced to in chapter 4, the 4 creatures were introduced to in chapter 4, the multitudes, which we saw in chapter 7, they're crying out in worshipful exuberance because Babylon has fallen. And what also happens here at the return of Christ, the parousia, the coming of Christ, is not only is Babylon judged, but the saints are brought into this great celebration of union with the Lamb. There's this marriage supper of the Lamb, right? And it's beautiful. And Jesus comes in power and authority and crushes all who oppose him, but he also communes with his own. By the way, look at verse 20 in chapter 19. What happens to the beast?
He's captured.
And who else?
A false prophet.
Now, who's the false prophet? Do you remember? Chapter 13, there were 2 beasts, remember? One from the sea, one from the land.
Yeah.
The second one from the land is also called the false prophet in chapter 16 in the bowls of wrath.
Yes.
So what most people think is those 2 types of beasts represent the political power and the religious power.
Huh. And
So-
which one being which?
The beast is the political power. The prophet is the religious power.
Right.
Because it makes people worship the image of the dragon or image of the beast by making them take the mark of the beast.
Right.
And they can't buy or sell because they don't worship the right stuff.
Right. It's in the name. False prophet. There we
Nailed
go.
it.
Got it.
Yep, he's the prophet. So, but look what happens to both of them. So they get captured, but then what? These two, it's still verse 20, the second half of verse 20.
These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur.
Well, what's the lake of fire?
Hades, hell.
Interesting phrase. What do you notice about the phrase lake of fire?
Well, it symbolizes lake is normally water.
Yeah.
The beast that comes from the water
Okay. What else?
burns with sulfur.
Does that seem self-defeating at all?
I don't know. I don't even self-defeating.
Well, how often what do you put fires out with?
Water.
Right.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating phrase. They're thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse. Who is that?
Jesus.
Yeah. So did the sword, did Jesus just one by one, slash every mighty king? Maybe. Or as Jesse described in his preaching, that's a symbol of the word. Jesus says, you've been judged by my word. And my word was that I would die for the nations, would die for the sins of the world. And my word is that I would come back. And everybody who didn't take refuge in the blood I provided, which is evidenced on my robe right now, you will face the wrath that is still stored up, as evidenced by this locality that is interesting for us called the lake of fire.
It's kind of fascinating because from dust we were made, to ashes we will go. In essence, the same is true for even Satan.
Well, that's an interesting question. We'll get into that later, but you have lots of interesting questions now on the theology of hell.
Interesting.
What I do think is interesting is this. Hell is a very interesting concept biblically, a true concept. I mean, I believe there is a hell. But I want to point this out. The lake of fire is a place reserved for the devil and his angels. They're the ones who are said that's where they go. But there will be others who will join them there. I don't want to give away the rest of the book.
Yeah.
But I think that's interesting. But notice who's not there. Who's not thrown into the lake of fire that you think should be?
The false prophet?
No, the false prophet joins the beast. The beast and the false prophet, beast from the sea, beast from the land, thrown in the lake of fire. Who else would you imagine should go there?
The kings and their armies?
Nope. So the kings and the armies they all die. They're all slain. Who else? Look at verse 2 of chapter 20.
Chapter 20? We haven't got to chapter 20.
I know. It's a little teaser.
You tease. I'm looking here. I'm like, we got chapter 20.
It's a good tease. It helps us think about this.
Well, what does verse 2 say?
Read it.
I don't have it.
God. All right. I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding in his hands the keys to the bottomless pit with a great chain, and he seized the dragon. Oh. That ancient serpent who is the devil and who we call Satan. So remember, chapter breaks are our addition. So this story is flowing. I think the story is flowing.
Wait, so we got the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire, but the Satan, he's not mentioned?
It was mentioned in the beginning of chapter 20. But where does he go? He's bound for 1,000 years and thrown into a pit. We'll get to this in our next podcast and our next sermon. So I guess the question I'd ask everybody, this is why I'm a premillennial, by the way. Why does the false prophet and the beast go to the lake of fire, but the dragon doesn't? What's up with that?
Yeah. Are you going to give us the answer, or is this just kind of cliffhanger?
Well, I'm just saying.
That's a to be continued.
Hold off. I don't want to spoil our last 2 podcasts on Revelation.
Okay, what else needs to be said as it pertains to America and Babylon?
I don't think a lot. I think it might not satisfy everyone, but is America Babylon? In some ways, right now, yes. In some ways, no, not fully. Story to be written. Could she become it? Yes. Could she turn and not? Yes. Hence why gospel presence, thinking like a Christian, living like a Christian, and I'm even going to say this within its proper place, voting like a Christian. Okay? In its proper place. The voting booth is not the primary tool of the Christian citizen, but it is a tool.
Yep.
Righteousness is a glory to a nation. Wickedness is a rebuke to a nation. So yeah, like there is a discipleship component, one of the tools. The mistake we make as American Christians is over prioritizing our religious Christian gospel kingdom duty to voting. But you can also make the mistake of under engaging or not realizing from a holistic approach to stewardship as citizens of heaven, but on this side of heaven, living in this land called America, that our vote should also reflect kingdom values. Right? This is why I would be pro Christians on the city council and in Congress and in government. I wouldn't say, let's just stand over in the corner. Well, it just seems dumb. We have something to say about what is right and what is good and what is holy, and we have a perspective on it. But we also have to be very careful, become overly nationalistic, where we think like our vote is everything. And the way in which we're going to bring the kingdom to bear on earth is through legislation or through our vote and our vote alone. It's those extremes have to be rejected. And we have to live in the stewarding tension of my vote is one of the tools. But I like to order it this way. While your vote can try to legislate the values of your nation, your example and your witness and your words is bottom up how you change your neighbors. And if we can change our neighbors with the gospel and teach them how to steward their voice, then the votes will also change the nation. Where you get in trouble is when you try to skip the process and take a shortcut. And you want votes and kings and powers and legislation and laws to change a nation, when the truth is all that will do is give you laws that your citizenry rebel against because their hearts are wicked.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's okay. We might, by the way, just tuck this one in your cap. I'm down for doing this. I've had some people in the church request I do it. Maybe we should do just a special July 4th episode on like voting and politics and like Christian way to think about it, because I think it's an important subject. And I don't often peel out time on Sundays to talk about this, but I think the podcast, just kind of an ad hoc special episode. It's not connected to Revelation. I just do a series around the 4th of July and just talk about how do I think about politics in America, in a society, and governance, and vote, and discipleship, and what does that look like? It'd be a fun conversation.
Okay, here's my last question for you.
Okay.
So there is kind of some holy irony, I think, in this, in that we have Brennan, who's planting a church called Maranatha. Jesse touched on this on Sunday. The name Maranatha means "Come, Lord Jesus."
Yeah, in Aramaic, by the way.
In Aramaic. And so no matter whether you're post-millennial, premillennial, partial preterist, amillennial, whatever it is, what's the heart posture of those who are waiting for Jesus's return right now?
Heart posture?
Yeah. Because there's a temptation to read the headlines and say, all right, because if you're a post-millennial, you're looking for things to get better, right? If you're a premillennial, you're like, oh, things are getting worse. Like Jesus must be coming. I mean, no matter your view, what's the Jesus view of how to view our culture and our country that we call home right now in the grand scheme of that?
Occupy until I come. That's the view. Steward, be faithful, lead yourself, lead your house, lead your church, lead your community in a way that is Christ-like, so that genuine bottom-up spiritual change is the revival basis for a nation. The truth is, in democratic Republican nations, I don't mean that the Republican Party, I mean the Democratic Republic of which we're a part, their laws and their leaders reflect the spiritual temperature of the country. If people are unhappy with Joseph R. Biden or Donald, is it R. Biden? Yeah, Joseph Biden, Donald Trump. If you're unhappy, one thing I would say is, in a certain sense, these leaders reflect us.
Yep.
So the laws a country passes and rights are an extension of things the country believes and longs for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if we're longing for independence from morality, independence from God, if we're longing for sexual expression as somehow something that will satisfy the deepest parts of our being and our identity, if we're longing for wealth at all costs, no matter who it exploits, if we're longing for ease, technological advancement, if we're longing for superiority and dominance, then our laws and our leaders will reflect it. This is why the way to think about, I think, Christianity in a nation, I actually have high esteem for our founding fathers. They didn't want Christianity to overtly dominate from the top down, because they had that in England.
Yeah.
Anglicanism. They had the Church of England running the show in bed with the politics. What they wanted was an educated and moral republic, a moral citizenry. And they saw, I think rightly, and they argued about this a lot, by the way, if you study your history. They wanted a Christianity that influenced the culture more from the bottom up than from the top down. That's why it's hard for people to figure out, well, why are there so many Christian artifacts in our nation's history for people to say we're not a Christian nation? And what I would say to you is this: the founding fathers were more interested in a nation of Christians because they believed a nation of Christians would better keep the nation Christian than a Christian nation could keep the nation Christian. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
A nation of Christians is more effective than a Christian nation telling its citizens they're Christians. So if this is why the church has been so, and I owe a lot of this education now to Dr. Jerry Sitzer. That's why the church has been so entrepreneurial and creative and influential and massive in American history, because Alexander de Tocqueville, a French historian, philosopher, whatever, writer, came and visited the American early mid 1800s and wrote about it. The American project is wild. So coming from a French perspective, like, they have very little laws. They have a very limited government. They have small government. How does it work? How do you get people to not steal, to not cheat, how do you do that? Well, one thing, the nation was smaller, so that the smaller something is, the less rigid structures it usually needs. But the huge secret sauce, he says, is Christianity. The impulse of Christianity as a bottom-up influencer caused people to embrace self-restraint. I don't need the government to pass a law that I shouldn't pick up a prostitute. The law of the Lord is enough restraint for me to not pick up a prostitute. I don't need the government to tell me that I should do this because the Lord has told me this. And if the majority of people are living out the law of the Lord, they're an easier people to govern.
Yeah.
The more lawless or godless a people become, the more every person is their own God. Therefore, you either have anarchy or you have dictatorship. You have despotism. Power locates in a government to control everybody's lives. So here's what we need to think about. You're getting the sneak peek of the July podcast, right? This is it. What we have to think about is this. If moral, religious, educated, thoughtful people fill up the citizenry of a nation, the less theoretical laws you'll need, and the more flourishing the government is put into positionally, because it doesn't have to do all that lifting.
Yeah.
But the more godless a country gets when it loses its religious moorings, then the more coercive its government has to be, because you either have order or anarchy. Where does order come from? Order is important. This is the beauty of Christianity, and it's the beauty of also, it's the utility of religion. Even in countries that aren't Christian, by influence or by decree, what religion functions as is some sort of ordering utility. This is why a lot of modern thinkers right now who aren't even Christians, they're even atheists or agnostics, they're starting to change their tune on if we need Christianity or not. Do you know Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, wrote the book God Delusion, one of the four horsemen of the new atheistic revolution of the early 2000s, has just come out and said in the last handful of months, I'm a cultural Christian? Have you heard that? He doesn't believe in God at all. But you know what he's saying? If I have to pick between a world and a society where there's no unifying ordering principle, I'll pick one with the ordering principle, and Christianity serves as a pretty decent one.
You're starting to see that too with people using Bible as utility.
Yeah. This is Jordan Peterson currently. Seems like he's getting ever closer to genuine Christian faith by the stuff he's saying. But there's a lot of people. This is Tom Holland, who's also a historian, lives in Europe, lives in England, wrote a wonderful book called Dominion on the influence of Christ crucified on Western civilization.
He's an atheist?
If he is, he either is or he's a baby Christian.
He's a diet atheist.
Or he's a baby Christian. I don't know where he's at. But this is, Justin Brierley's book, Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God, is a great book to read on this subject. This is happening across our world right now. Because here's what's happening. Some people are putting their hand to the ground and they're going, if we don't have a unifying ordering principle, what do we have? I'll tell you what you have. You have the book of Judges. Everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. What does that create? I'll tell you. Streets of drug addiction, crime, exploitation, perversion, destruction of all that is good and all that is beautiful. Humanity left to their base desires with no impulse control. So, yeah, we're now in like political science theory. Sorry. But I guess this fits Babylon. Yeah. Quite frankly, this does fit the conversation.
Yeah.
Is America Babylon? Well, what is the American project? How did it start? What does it mean to be limited government? What does e pluribus unum mean? Out of many, one. I mean, so the American project got a lot of great things associated with it. It's in a rough spot right now, it seems.
Yeah.
And it either is going to go by the way of Babylon, as all nations have, or it's going to have an experience a revival. How do we get that revival? Well, I would say it's not less than voting like a Christian, but it's certainly more. And you can't think that like, we're just going to get the right president in the office. You are deluded.
Yeah.
No matter how you want to vote this November. We need revival. We need change from the bottom up. We need change at a city council level, at a school board level. Let me go even further. We need change at a husband, father, mother, home level.
Yeah.
We need our homes to change. We need the way we're raising our children to change. Our churches need to play our part. We have to contend. And whether you're a premillennial and you think it's all going to get worse, here's the danger of premillennialism, and I will admit this. The idea that we think we read the prophetic timetable as it getting darker is not an excuse to bury your head in the sand or build a bunker.
That's good.
Occupy until he comes.
Yep.
Be salt, leaven, and light. If there's something about postmillennialism I like, it's that the way it reads prophecy tends to maybe make you feel like we better do something because it's on us.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the right biblical interpretation. So I think the way we should do this is, I think what the Bible's saying is it will get dark, and Jesus is the only light that comes on the white horse at the end of the day to make all things new. But until that day, I think we have to recognize we have a part to play. We have a voice that we must use. We have an example we must illustrate, and it's self-sacrificial, it's prophetic, it says things people don't like. We're going to speak the truth even if you get mad at us for it, and we're going to love you even sacrificially instead of try to force you to do what we want. And that winsome, self-sacrificial, engaged approach to kingdom building is what we've got to do. And we're building the church because she's an outpost of heaven on this side of eternity, and that is the community that should exude these characteristics of when Christ comes and the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our God.
Yeah, that's good. You know what else is good news? There's a word you've been using for the last 6 months. We're finally going to do a podcast on it. Next week, we are recording a podcast on the millennium.
Yes.
And TBT, but we might have a special guest joining us.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if that schedule works out. We haven't confirmed that, but if it's just me and you, we'll do our best.
We'll still have a good time.
But I got a lot. I think I got slides.
Oh boy!
Yeah, we got pictures.
It's not a podcast; it's a presentation.
This is a big deal. I think a bunch of people might say it would have been helpful if you did this at the very beginning of the series, but I don't think so actually, because I don't want people to read Revelation from the perspective of chapter 20. I don't. I want you to read it as a discipleship and worship guide. Mm-hmm. When you get to the very end, you realize that there's a major debate on what in the world is happening in chapter 20. Mm-hmm. This will be the subject of my sermon this week. It'll also be the subject of a special episode podcast next week before we get to the very, very end and have a conclusion.
This is very on brand for you. You are a huge Christopher Nolan buff, and the thing with his movies is it's not until the final second of the movie that you get the unveiling.
I hope the last few weeks of Revelation, we have 2 weeks left. I hope everyone just goes, yeah, that'd be great. Does that pay off? Or we slide into home base. One of the two.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, we'll see you guys back next week. Peace.